Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to you all.
Hi.
Yes, Happy New Year, Happy New Year. Christian?
Yes, it's me.
Yes, okay, yes, I recognize your voice, yes.
Yes, good to see you.
Good night, everyone. On behalf of the Trade and Economic Development Unit, I would like to say Happy New Year 2021 and to wish each of you and to your respective families a prosperous 2021. The Trade and Economic Development Unit has adopted the position of disseminating information on key issues of national, regional, and even international relevance. And tonight's topic is, of course, no different. I would like to, however, let you all know that the speakers who are carded to present this afternoon, including Dr. Anthony Gonzalez, Dr. Sawari, and Dr. Hossain, have come together to prepare a detailed research-based publication on the overall impact of the Venezuelan situation and the migrant flows on the TNT economy. As such, over the next couple of weeks, several of the installments of our National Conversation series will be focused on this very topic. Tonight, we are having the first installment, and the discussion is being led off by Dr. Anthony Gonzalez. He's going to be presenting tonight on predicting Venezuelan migrant flows for 2021 as a contextual framework for understanding what we are going to have to be dealing with over the next 12 months. So, Dr. Gonzalez, please proceed.
Yes, thank you very much, Rebecca, and a Happy New Year to all colleagues, attendees. I hope that this year will be good for all of us, and particularly our unit, TEDU. I look forward to having a good year with all of you. Let me say that in our last discussion, I was a little concerned that we did not have any idea as to what the migrant flows from Venezuela would look like. We were discussing, you remember, the labor market and various aspects, the socio-economic profiles of Venezuelans here and so forth. But I felt we needed to have some idea as to what to expect. And after that, I discovered that when I started to read, I discovered that there were some observers who were saying that the Venezuelan migrant flows will surpass that of Syria in 2021. The Syrian migrant flow was about 6.7 million at its highest point. And they were expecting that in this year, 2021, the Venezuelan flow will go beyond that. I will come back to that in a short while. So that that was one of the motivating factors to look at that. Of course, there are other factors such as one is to have some kind of idea of what to expect in order to manage migration. You know, we need to be able to assess what is likely to come. We need to prepare scenarios and be able to react. It's also important in terms of doing population estimates to have some idea of what migration will mean. So what I want to do is to just basically look at what we could expect for 2021. I'll come down to Trinidad and Tobago, but I'll start by in a global context and try to see basically what is coming out of Venezuela. Now, there are difficulties in forecasting migration, and I should be very frank with you here. There are a lot of different concepts about migrants, and a lot of these concepts are pretty ambiguous. They're not properly defined, and they tend to vary a lot between countries. So that, you know, once these concepts are not clear, you get a diversity of motives for migration, problems in terms of classifying who's a refugee, who's a migrant, you know, who's an asylum seeker and so forth. So you have different categories. So that is a difficulty that I need to point out from the very start. But I don't want to dwell on that because I have only about 15, 20 minutes, and I just want to present the core of what I have here today. The second problem, of course, is the well-known one of data, statistics. That is, they do not really capture the migration processes. You have a situation where countries collect information in a different way, and it's very difficult to compare the data between countries. I think that is well known, and to some extent we have to work to improve it, but at the same time we have to work with what we have. So that is a problem we need to signal from the outset. Finally, and probably the most important, most importantly, you have a problem of the analytical frameworks. The theories of migration are not very comprehensive. They are based largely on disciplines. Some, are concerned with the economics of migration, and the theory will be economic. Others are based on political factors and so forth. And as such, it makes prediction very, very difficult because the theory doesn't, in a comprehensive way, take account of all the factors that one needs to look at in terms of predicting migration flows. You have efforts at present to try to build more comprehensive theories. I've been read some stuff recently where the guys talk about integrating policies plus the structural factors, and you have to look at from the countries from which they are coming and the countries that are receiving them. So you have to look at it across on both sides of the fence, so to speak. So that essentially, these are some of the main problems. You have a lot of uncertainty and complexity in the migration processes. It's almost impossible to predict some of these things. And one of the best examples is Germany, where they engage in very sophisticated foresighting and predicting. And they had anticipated so many Arabs to come 4 or 5 years ago when you had that Syrian flow. But none of them predicted the kind of flow that would come to Germany. If you remember, it was probably about 1 or 2 million that ended up in Germany. And they used very sophisticated models to do that, but they were way off in terms of the calculations. So just a bit point that out in terms of indicating the kind of difficulties we face in this kind of exercise. Now, the key thing about modeling is that the model must really explain the process well. It must try to identify the key determinants, the key drivers, in order to try to properly classify, first of all, the migrants in some kind of useful category. The data, as I said, must also be of high quality. You have, if the data period is too short, you find that it's not possible to work with it. And this is one of the problems that working with Venezuela, the period is still relatively short. And we all know that in a short period, let's say 4 or 5 years, there's not much that you could really predict from such a short period. And especially where there's a lot of instability in the processes, where you have a lot of shocks occurring, and it's very difficult to really anticipate what may lie ahead. The assumptions also have to be realistic, and in that sense, we have to try and all the time be revising our assumptions and looking at what is reasonable in the situation. And then finally, I think we have to be able to say something about uncertainty. We have to be able to engage in some kind of risk management exercise and say what is reasonable to expect in the years ahead. Well, what I did was to begin with a model by Baja and Barrios. This is a piece of work they did 2 years ago, and they based it on the availability of food and medicines. And they argued that migrants would flow out of Venezuela as food and medicine became unavailable. The model is essentially based on the amount of calories, the minimum amount of calories you need for nutrition, and that they assume could be imported by all the foreign currency earnings that the country had. So that if the foreign currency earnings of the country, for example, what they get from oil and what they get from foreign aid, what they get from remittances and so on, if that is made available, and that can provide the basic minimum calories for the population, then if everybody got that minimum amount of calories, you would not have a problem of migration. So that that's essentially the notion behind the model. It assumes that if there's a deficiency in terms of the the amount of calories available, then that would be reflected in terms of the migration. Of course, the model makes certain assumptions about food being distributed efficiently. That is, that if you have this amount of money and you bring in food, you bring it in efficiently and you distribute it at a relatively good price. And as such, that would not be a hindrance in terms of the basic minimum reaching the population. So essentially what the model did was to use the three factors. It used the oil production in Venezuela, the price of oil, and the inflows of foreign resources as aid and remittances. It started with a basic scenario in November 2018. And here you see the three basic factors. One is the annual remittances, foreign aid, which they estimated at the end of 2018 to be 2.4 billion. And then they calculated that the oil production in Venezuela was 1.17 million barrels per day. And the oil price at that time, they estimated, was roughly around $54 per barrel. And on that basis, they estimated that around 8.2 million Venezuelans, migrants, would result in the near future as we moved out of 2018. They never said exactly when, how much, but 2 years from 2018, 3 years from 2018. What they said, yes, the migrant population, which was around probably about, at that time, it was probably about 3.5 million. They estimated that it would reach 8.2 million. Now, I have two quick charts, which I don't want to spend too much time on them, but just to point out to you. Here you see, for instance, the red is the oil price, and you can see the descent. For instance, this is the trend line, where oil declined precipitously from over about $100 a barrel to something like $40 a barrel here. We are very familiar with that. And on the other side, we have the migration. This is very migration in 2010. Here is 2015. 2017, we begin to see Venezuelans starting to move, and it just shot up, right, to this figure by 2020. 2020, it's about 5 points. The estimate is of about 5.3 million, 5.4 million. Okay, so you see, to some extent, the oil price is a factor. Similarly, oil production is a factor. We look at the same kind of decline in oil production. We see Venezuelan oil production dropping for a high of about 3.5, I think it was, just over 3.5 million barrels a day to anything like about 600,000 barrels a day in 2020. Now that is a precipitous decline. I can't understand, for example, how Venezuela is surviving on this kind of deterioration in oil production. But that is what it is, and we have to look at the implications of that. Now, it is clear to me that the model overestimates the flows, in that by the end of 2020, the amount of migrants was 5.4 million. And if we plug in the current conditions, the same current conditions, the oil production today is about, let's say, 0.7 million barrels. The price of oil is below $50, but yet still I put $51 in the model. And then I generously gave $3 billion in foreign aid. I think in 2018, they were getting about 2.4 billion in foreign aid and remittances. Remittances are pretty small. Venezuelans don't get too many remittances because there are not too many of them abroad. They never migrated before, so remittances are still very small. So that the bulk of it is really foreign aid. So that if you plug this into the model, you do a kind of sensitivity analysis, you would get 12.3 million refugees coming out of Venezuela. So you see the model is very sensitive to the fall in oil production, oil price of just $50 or $51 a barrel. And even though you increase aid, you find the migrant flow is still very large, which would be about 38.5% of the Venezuelan population of 2080. And the model is very sensitive to changes in aid remittances. For instance, if I drop aid to 2 billion, I keep the same figures for oil production, 0.7 million barrels, and $51 or a $51 oil price, which is a generous oil price because we know the oil price is not going over 50 now, between something 40 and 50 now. You get a migrant outflow of something like 16.4 million Venezuelans, which is huge. So just by dropping the foreign aid aspect of it, you find that there's a significant movement of Venezuelans. And what I did is to say, okay, what would be these three factors look like if we confine the migrant flow to 7 million Venezuelans? Because this is what, as you shall see later, this is what many of the agencies are saying, that they expect that this year it might be about 7 million, some say 8 million and so forth. But let us say that there's 7 million people. What the oil production would have to be, according to this model, is 1.2 million barrels. The price of oil would have to be about $51 per barrel, and the annual remittances would have to be about $3 billion. So that we see the challenges here. First of all, the oil price is not anywhere near $51 as far as I know right now. It's probably still in the 40s. The oil production is way down 0.7 million. They may be able to get it up later this year, probably over 1 million. And then we have to hope that aid would increase to some extent from where it is right now. So on that, based on those conditions, the author largely concluded that the available resources flowing into the country are not enough to import all the necessary food to complement the basic nutritional needs of those citizens living under the poverty line. And without the minimum caloric needs, these people will be forced to migrate. So that the prediction is kind of dire that, look, unless they get a major inflow of aid, they're likely to face a major catastrophe. And I think the authors who wrote this, and here I suspect, I don't have any evidence, but I suspect that they were trying to target the international agencies to say, look, what you have given Syria, for example, the Syrian refugees got billions and billions of dollars. I don't have the figure, but some people talk about 10 billion or 50 billion or something. They're huge figures as compared to what has been given to the Venezuelan migrants. So I just pointed these things out today to point out that some of the factors that may work in terms of cushioning the effect. But as I said, we are in an uncertain world, and we have to take that into account. Well, factually, the Institute of Migration has concluded in November last year that there would be a total of 5.4 million Venezuelans in exile. That is 5.4 million Venezuelan refugees. In June 2019, the OAS, in a special committee, assessed the flow to be between 7.5 and 8.2 million in 2020. Right? In December 2020, a new report from the OAS warned that the number of refugees and migrants could rise to 7 million in 2021 if the countries of the region reopen their borders and the regime in Venezuela remains in place. The report notes that with the arrival of the pandemic, about 5,000 Venezuelans fled the country daily. So that on average from 2017, you had 1.4 million Venezuelan refugees leaving Venezuela. And if that trend continues, the total may well come to about 7 million in 2021. So the OS may not be totally off, except that borders have been closed, and all the regular routes have been closed as a result of the pandemic. Colombia and a lot of them, we in Trinidad, we have shut down our borders and so on. And then you have the phenomenon of migrants going back home. And this, I think, would tend to impact somewhat on the flow. In addition, I would say in 2021, you're likely to have a change in the approach to dealing with Venezuela. And I tend to feel that the new American administration would approach this problem differently. They may want to probably put more aid for humanitarian purposes to deal with the migrant problem. And they may want to also adopt a new approach to negotiation. I see already, for example, the European Union accept that they're dropping Guaido and that they want a whole new, they will recognize him as the opposition leader, but they would not recognize him head of government. And they're trying to approach the negotiations in a no way. But Biden says he wants to work with Europeans together. So I suspect that the Americans will, to some extent, follow that approach. And they may therefore decide to have a new approach to negotiation. If that comes, it may come with probably a little more aid, and in that way, that along with the closure of borders and the difficulties that the neighboring countries are having, may well see a slightly less flow. And this is why, to some extent, I tend to feel that we may drop somewhat below the 7 million. That is to say, you may have an increase of about 600,000 to 900,000 migrants, and that would give you between 6 to 6.3 billion for 2021. This is my guess at the end of all of this, that if you take into account these factors as I described them, you may get probably the migrant flow going up from 5.4 million in 2020 to about 6 or 6.3 million in 2021. Now, what are the implications of this for Trinidad and Tobago? United Nations High Commission for Refugees estimated that there are about 24,000 registered Venezuelans here in the country. This is at the end of 2020. And they estimated that about 30,000 would be here by December 2021. So they're seeing more or less an increase of about 6,000 for 2021. Now, of course, this deals largely with what you may call the legal entrants. And we all know that the legal entrants are also very, very important. We have no way of calculating what the legal entrants are. I noticed in a survey that the UNHCR did, there were about 14 to 20% people who were not registered. But if you take that into account, that would just make a very small addition to the existing figure. If you take into account the total amount of refugees for 2020, total amount of refugees that left Venezuela in 2020, which was 5.4 million, and you say that the 24 million was roughly about less than half of 1% of that, then it would mean that you're talking about about 24,000 in Trinidad in 2020, and that would probably go up by another 4,500, yes, 4,500 or 5,000 may come to Trinidad next year on that basis. These would be more or less what you call the registered people. If you double that figure and you say, okay, you believe that about 40,000 Venezuelans are here, you have another 20,000 illegally who are here, then that figure would have to be increased by about 10,000. So that we are probably looking at an increase of what is here of between 5,000 to about 10,000 next year. So if you have 40,000 already here, you're probably looking at a maximum figure of about 50,000 or 55,000. Now, all of this, as I said, is based on a lot of uncertainty. The price of oil is impossible. We all know it's impossible to predict. While production may increase, it may hardly be matched by an oil price over $50 a barrel. So, we have to take that into account. Venezuela needs an oil price of over $60 at this point in time. And that and to get that is extremely difficult in the current situation. So that even if the oil climbs to 1 million barrels per day, they will certainly have tremendous amount of difficulty in terms of providing the basics for the population. So that to conclude, I think more aid would definitely be needed. However you look at it, for 2021, aid could be significant in terms of cushioning the flows, and I would think that you would probably need aid of the order of $3 or $4 billion to help in that regard. Now, beyond 2021, I wouldn't like to predict. I think it's filled with a lot of uncertainties. I think 2021, the situation may more or less remain as it is, given what, more or less moderated by what I said. But if you go beyond 2021 and the problem is not solved, I think you're likely to see a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and you're likely to see the political aspects becoming more important. The political conflict may grow. I think with the new American administration, they may take 2021 as the year to try to solve this problem, and they're going to probably spend a year doing that, and in which case you may have some kind of possibility for lessening the flow. But let me stop at this point, and then I'm prepared to answer any questions that may arise. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. So I think this was an excellent contextual discussion in terms of the expectations. It it maps out some of the macro issues in terms of what's been happening or what's likely to happen in Venezuela and how that is going to impact on the region and Trinidad and Tobago by extension. At this time, I'm going to invite Dr. Sawari to respond. So Dr. Sawari, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry I missed so much. My apologies to all of you for being late. It's difficult to respond to all the information that has been given there. I came in at the point when Dr. Gonzalez was indicating the sensitivity between the number of migrants and the various economic factors, whether they be oil price or other factors. And I then followed the discussion from there, trying to make sense from my point of view, having missed a lot of it, of where we were focused in that particular presentation. Dr. Gonzalez, from what I heard, was very clear, lucid in his presentation, and basically showed what was happening in Venezuela and what would affect it and how this was likely to affect the outflows of migrants from Venezuela, and then dealt with the Trinidad and Tobago situation and gave an assessment of where we are and where we were likely to be by the end of 2021. And it looks like we could possibly have between 30 and 50,000 Venezuelans here in Trinidad and Tobago by the end of 2021. Without making the distinction between those who were legal, those who were illegal, and who were migrants and who might be presenting themselves as refugees. Now, that I think that makes for a complex and difficult situation for Trinidad and Tobago, which in our present economic circumstances really is a point of pressure on the country. And the only way that we can deal with this reality, and we do not have control over the realities in Venezuela, we can only hope to influence at best and to respond, but also to act. And the question would be whether, in fact, we could take advantage of the presence of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago to help to create the conditions for economic benefit in this country. Now, before I go there, I want to say a couple of things, which is that in one of the pieces that I've been reading, it indicates that 22% of the Caribbean population, that is to say, population of CARICOM, actually live abroad. That immigration in the Caribbean is mostly intra-Caribbean immigration, moving from island to island. And this Venezuelan migrant thing, though not as heavy in other islands, is really a new phenomenon for the entire region. And for Trinidad and Tobago, it is particularly a big issue because of the large size of Venezuela, the large size of the migrant population, the nearness of our location to Venezuela, our current economic circumstance, which is, in my view, dire. And the question remains, with this new phenomenon of Venezuelan migration, it hasn't been as new for us as it is to the rest of CARICOM, but it is a new phenomenon in terms of the numbers and in terms of the impact. You know, how do we deal with this or try to manage this? And I think we are past the point where we can think of any kind of managed migration from Venezuela now. That time is long past. It is something that we could have perhaps addressed in maybe 2014 or 15 or sometime before, and we could have been very successful with that. And at the present time, we have no option of that kind. I think the question would simply be, how do we address the population that we have here now? And one of my problems with Trinidad and Tobago's response or potential response to the Venezuelan immigration issue here is the fact that, except for the institutions that are involved in helping the Venezuelans, the churches and the church-sponsored organizations and Venezuelans themselves in Trinidad and Tobago and other social support institutions, I am not aware that there is any clear strategy for integration of the Venezuelans here after the point at which they are documented and given the right to live and to function and to work. And I know that there is no policy with regard to those Venezuelans who are undocumented. It is simply a responsive policy, which is to say, you might one day send people back home, you might one day arrest people, or you might take a laissez-faire attitude and live and let live in the country. So as far as policy beyond the attempt at documentation is concerned, there is none. But what is troublesome, what is even more troublesome than that, is that I cannot discern any policy at home to deal with our very critical economic situation that we are in. That is to say, without going into any details of the issue, because this is not what today's session is about, there is no solution strategy, let's say, for the energy situation. And I only mention that in the context of the fact that we have pressure on the foreign exchange in terms of reserves, pressure on the price of the dollar, and basically shortages and scarcity, which basically stymie the economy. So there is no policy or strategy that is addressing that. Secondly, there is no other strategy that I can see for foreign exchange earnings outside of the energy sector. So I am not seeing any clear strategy for import substitution. I'm not seeing any clear strategy for exports expansion based on the industries that we have here now, let's say manufacturing. And I'm not seeing any new investment or any diversification agenda. I do not see any self-sufficiency strategy for agriculture. I don't see any shifts in the balance of trade. And it's very, very difficult to see in the absence of any strategic direction for policy, how you're going to have a coherent strategy for managing Venezuelans and the Venezuelan migrants as an economic asset in the absence of policies that uplift the economy, change the direction of Trinidad and Tobago, help to force a recovery in the depleted state that we are because of COVID, and really turn these human capital assets into a point of leverage to boost the economy and to help to stymie the recovery, and of course to deal with the dire foreign exchange situation that is going to emerge over the next 18 months or so, given the present rate at which we are going. So I will stop at this point, and the summary point I want to make is that the only things that we have control over here in Trinidad and Tobago is a strategy for economic recovery, policies to make that possible, from moving out of the shadow of the pandemic, and within that framework to develop a positive strategy which sees the Venezuelan immigration problem here not as a problem, but as an opportunity, and the human resource capacity not as a burden, but as a point of leverage, as something to enhance our own capacity to recover and to grow and to create a more buoyant economy, export-oriented. So I think the Venezuelan situation here, the immigrants here in Trinidad and Tobago, because of the lack of policy clarity, because of the lack of economic strategy, because of the lack of any monetary policy together with an economic strategy that could basically address our foreign exchange challenge while we do the things that are necessary to conserve foreign exchange, to save foreign exchange expenditure, and to bring foreign exchange in. I see this being, I see the Venezuelan situation being a situation that really adds to the burden of entrapment in which I think the government is finding itself and is taking the country. I do not know whether the government is willing to engage in discussion about this and whether they are willing to listen. But I am predicting that we are on a very disastrous course here that can only be compounded by the Venezuelan immigration issue if we do not develop a strategy and a set of policies that would basically deal with the economic situation and the crisis that we have in foreign exchange, and creates the conditions in which we can be as self-sufficient as possible and import less, substitute more, and begin to export more and have more investments come into Trinidad and Tobago. And part of the solution to the Venezuelan presence here, therefore, in Trinidad and Tobago, is to see these bodies and intellectual capital assets at whatever level as, in fact, assets to be leveraged and resources to be strategically deployed. But that can only be done if there is clarity of policy, clarity of strategy, and a sense of purpose going forward that addresses the problems that have put us in this situation of entrapment in which we are locked. And I will close at this point, and I thank Dr. Gonzalez for his presentation, which, as I said, was lucid and clear and poses the problem for Trinidad and Tobago. And I am saying that the problem can be something that presents a solution, but I don't see how that solution can be found unless we begin to address how we get out of this current crisis, and we are not doing that. There's nothing that I see that the government is doing that promises to take us out of this particular crisis.
Dr. Sawari, thank you very much for your contribution. Ladies and gentlemen, I am going to ask you to submit your questions or your comments via the WhatsApp chat. In addition to which, if any of you would like to have blasts via WhatsApp delivered periodically coming out of these national conversations, please feel free to personal message me your WhatsApp number. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Dr. Hussain, and also to let you all know and remind you that we will be opening up the floor shortly to allow you to interact with our speakers. Dr. Hussain?
Thank you very much. Okay, Rebecca?
Yes.
Okay, so I felt that Professor Gonzalez gave a really clear outline of the broad parameters associated with some of the migrant issues. I also appreciated the push towards the deployment of some type of sanity, statistical sanity, to explain or to provide an impression of the amount of Venezuelans that could eventually leave Venezuela and by extension end up on our shores. I posted for him 4 little comments. I'm not sure he saw it as yet, Rebecca. You may have to private message him to make sure that Professor Gonzalez sees it on the chat group. And so he could reflect on them while I basically respond. So this is a little picture here of the Marielitos. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The Cuban boat people that went to Miami in the 1980s. And this year are Venezuelans leaving for Colombia. And you know, it's a mass movement of people, very trying, very traumatic. And the way I like to approach these things is very simple. So this complements well with what Professor Gonzalez spoke about and what Dr. Tiwari later responded to. And one of the things we are very bad at in Trinidad and Tobago is understanding the facts associated with the problem. And so in my career as an economist, I have always taken a step backward, sometimes at great personal cost, in terms of, you know, you publish something and someone will say, well, that's on Trinidad and Tobago, that's not important. I don't care. I have decided I will carry that personal cost if I have to. This year shows, this simple model shows that the labor force in previous times was N. And the demand curve for labor given by VMPL 0, the value of the marginal product, was D0. So that initially GDP let us say in 2018 was ABN0. GDP, let us say in 2018 was ABN0, and I will just say non-energy GDP. In fact, and in 2018, that would have been about, if I remember correctly, about 118 billion. With an inflow, and I see that Professor Gonzalez, I was glad to see that he somehow hovered around 50,000 in the end, because that's the estimation I have as well about the amount of Venezuelans here. It shifts the supply curve of labor to the right, so it moves from S0 to S1, and there is an increase in GDP from ABN0 to AGL0, of which BGLN represents the increase in GDP. And this increase in GDP has two parts, BGH and GLNH. And BGH and GLNH could be measured. In fact, I went so far as to make a rough, and this, I know the media would be on, these are some rough numbers. They are not numbers I would put in the public domain as yet, although I think they are reasonably accurate. And we have the area BGH being 24.8 billion between 2018 and 2020. In other words, the immigrant surplus, which accrues to capital, is about $24.8 million. And the immigrant wages the immigrant contribution to GDP, the wages aspect is much higher. Now, one of the things that we are not properly exploiting with the immigrants, but that the state seems to be getting into in 2021, is the externality benefits. Because not only would the demand curve, the supply curve for labor shift, but also the demand curve for labor. So let me see if I can explain that some more. You have, let's say you take on these Venezuelans, so you have a supply curve of 50,000 workers coming into Trinidad and Tobago, but then there is an increase in demand for housing, and an increase in demand for grocery products, and an increase in demand for capital to work with these 50,000 Venezuelans. And if that process is managed, and I listen carefully to Dr. Tiwari, if it is managed in a structured, and that's a word that we sometimes have difficulty coming to terms with in Trinidad and Tobago, in a structured way and in a planned way, in a careful way, we may be able to experience a much larger gain in GDP than what we saw under the static case of just the supply curve shifting. And I am in the process of estimating the various areas under the curve, under the segment, within the segment A prime, C prime, L0. Now, just some closing comments here. What I've noticed, Dr. Tiwari and Professor Gonzalez, is that the immigration surplus, the part of the benefits to capital on account of an increase in immigrant labor, that's the immigration surplus, is small. And so the question then is, how do we get capital and labor to interact together for the best outcome of Trinidad and Tobago? What I fear is happening, and I raised this with Professor Gonzalez many times, and we have good discussion on it, is my data, and I've actually collected some data on this together with a student, is telling me that the capital, Professor Gonzalez, is following the labor. And the labor, because we have 16,523 Venezuelans registered, but about 50,000 Venezuelans. So UNHCR puts it at 40,000. And if we had about 10 more thousand coming, that's 50,000. So we have 35,000 more than the 16,000. So, sorry, we have out of the 50,000, 16,000 is registered. So about 35,000 more, which would therefore be unregistered. And to stay out of the limelight and out of the radar of the national security channels, these 35,000 unregistered Venezuelans are likely to go into the informal sector. If they go into the informal sector, so I see some of my colleagues are on, so I would mention there is a street close to me called Charles Street, and there is this particular bar that I see about 7 Venezuelan women working, and the bar expanded in size to complement the 7 Venezuelan women, so that capital followed the labor, and there was an increase in economic activity in the informal sector that is under the radar and therefore pulls resources probabilistically out of the potential non-energy export sector. And that has me very worried. That has me very worried because the numbers I am seeing, Professor Gonzalez, and I know you have a different view, is telling me that there is the possibility that unsupervised migration of the form that we are having in part has the capacity to reduce the size of the non-energy export sector and the import substituting sector, and therefore to lead to a current account balance implication and a bowel cause disease, because, and I'm saying this specifically for Professor Gonzalez and Dr. Tiwari now, because the Rybczynski effect of the 50,000 workers is to lead to an increase in the size of the sectors that absorb those workers and a migration of capital away from the other sectors into those labor-intensive sectors, and therefore the possibility of a compromise in the growth process in the long run. Now, I'm not sure how much sense that is making, but it's very clear to me that unless we find a way to attract labor to capital in the non-energy export sector and the import substituting industrialization, sorry, the import substituting sector, then we run the risk in a 3-sector model with, I've left out energy, with an informal sector, an import substituting sector, and a non-energy export sector, that the informal sector can expand via the Rybczynski approach at the expense of the import substituting and non-energy sector. So what I will do is I would leave that there. And in the question and answer session, I would respond. And I suspect Dr. Gonzalez, Professor Gonzalez will have something to say. And then we will try to make it into a format that is much more palatable. But as it stands, what I am seeing is an attempt by the state with the 16,523 Venezuelans that we have some degree of structure and under the radar, and followed by the radar. But there is the possibility that the chunk that came thereafter can create a degree of skewness in our production function that worries me. So thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Hussein. I do have a comment here. Can you just in your review or in a few minutes time, just break down this concept of the immigration surplus a little bit more for us? Ladies and gentlemen, at this time, I want to invite you to raise your hand if you have a question or comment, after which you can unmute your mic and direct your questions accordingly. So while we are getting ready, Dr. Gonzalez, there's a question that has been posted here. for you, is it possible that the migrant issue between TNT and Venezuela can really mirror that which exists between the US and Mexico, in that migrants may increase the overall productivity of Trinidad and Tobago persons, given that the jobs that the migrant laborers do are the ones that Trinbagonians aren't necessarily willing to do? In addition to which, you have the issue of the skill distribution of the migrant labor and the implication of that for our local labor market. Dr. Hussein, I know that you posted a few questions to Dr. Gonzalez. So if you would like to ask, please feel free to go ahead and do so, and then we can take the round of answers as needed.
No
Okay.
problem. So let me make sure that Prof is seeing the questions.
Yeah, I'm seeing the
Prof, are you
questions.
seeing the questions by chance?
Yeah, I'm seeing the questions, yes.
Right, good. So okay, over to you.
Yeah, well, let me start with the question about productivity. And I think it's clear that migrants do improve productivity. And this is acceptable all over the world. Migrants come to work hard. They work for lower wages, longer hours, and so on. And therefore, generally, productivity does increase. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. We see it all over the world. The same thing that happened in the United States would happen here with migrants coming here. The issue, however, that Roger raises is slightly different in that he's suggesting that capital tends to follow labor, and labor will tend to go into the informal sector. And by the informal sector, he means the sector where doesn't earn foreign exchange. It's largely the non-tradable informal sector, things like bars and restaurants and stuff like that, and so that the capital would follow that labor into those industries, and those industries would expand, and we would not have the benefit of that labor going into sectors where they are needed, like agriculture, like manufacturing, and into export-oriented activity. Now, where I have difficulty with that is that I'm not sure that capital follows labor, in the sense that a lot of these areas of the non-tradable sector, if you take the retail sector, if you take the very thing he mentioned, for example, bars and restaurants, these sectors are under tremendous stress. We don't have the disposable income to sustain them. A lot of them I see around already closing down, and they'll be hit, of course, by the pandemic, but I believe there's also underlying that a serious demand factor caused by the fact that many people have lost their jobs and so forth. Incomes have declined, and people are looking down the road and they don't have the confidence to spend and so forth. So consumption is declining. And in that situation, the non-tradable sector is likely to suffer a lot. We're not going to go back to the retail. They can't get foreign exchange to do a lot of the things that they would like to do. So I can't see capital following labor in that sense. I think capital follows a rate of return. If the retail rate of return is good in the non-tradable sector, or rather the tradable sector, it will go into the tradable sector once the incentives arise, and there's higher profits to be made in the tradable sector. So I see capital as looking for opportunities, but probably not seeing that their profits could be sustained or even properly gained in the non-tradable sector. And remember that the non-tradable sector in an economy like ours are sustained by booms, by commodity booms, and by deficit spending from the government. The government gets the revenue from the commodity booms, and the government spends it lavishly on a whole lot of public sector activity, building roads and expanding things and employing more people. And that is what drives the non-tradable sector. Now, I think we're in a situation where the government is not in that position to drive the non-tradable sector as it did before. The government just doesn't have the revenue again. The government has to start cutting its expenditure. A lot of things we see all in education and several areas the government has started trimming its cloth to suit its jacket, so to speak. So I don't expect that the non-tradable sector will experience any kind of heavy demand. There's going to be, of course, some government spending. They're going to continue with some of the essential roads and some of the essential activity, but I don't think that is large enough to sustain the kind of informal, non-tradable sector that Roger has in mind. And when I look around, I tend to see that I was looking at the survey they did, UNHCR did in 2019, towards the end of 2019. They did a survey and they tended to show a lot of Venezuelans were going into retail business, they were going into construction, of course, they were going into manufacturing and agriculture. I think at the margin, we're beginning to see, as the economy, and I think Dr. Sawari is correct, in the sense that unless the non-tradable sector expand and we have the tradable sector expand, and we have a strategy to push that in manufacture, in services, things like tourism and so forth, foreign exchange earning activities, then we are going to have serious problems down the road. So that I'm hoping that we begin to see this taking place pretty soon, so that you get that kind of expansion in that tradable sector, where you begin to see more and more Venezuelans going. Now, the commentator also made reference to the question of skilled labor, and we dealt with that the last time. I remember saying that skilled labor is definitely an asset from migrant labor, and especially for the export sector. If you get skilled labor, then I think you're sitting pretty in terms of how the export sector would benefit. And skilled labor definitely improves productivity and improves growth as compared to unskilled labor. The question is, how much skilled labor are you getting, and does it meet the needs that you require? I've looked at the UNHCR published a survey they did not long ago, and they showed how many people had education. I think they showed about a third of the migrants here had roughly education at the tertiary level, about half at university, no, about 2/3 at a technical level, and about a third of that at the university level. And about over 60% had secondary education. So there's a fair amount of skilled outside there. It's more than I anticipated it would have been, given the fact that most of our migrants come from rural Venezuela. They come from the eastern parts of Venezuela, to Copita, Pedernales, and Ciudad Bolivar, and so forth. And therefore, they would tend to be probably less educated than those that would come from Caracas. But the fact that you see 16,000 went and registered is an indication to some extent that there's a certain level of education. Only migrants with a certain level of education tend to go and register themselves because they feel more confident in dealing with the authorities. So I would answer these questions in this way. I may have missed something. I don't know if I've covered all the questions, but I'll come back later on to cover those that I didn't address. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. There were a few questions specifically posted. Dr. Hussein?
Can I ask for the floor to respond to Professor Gonzalez on a question?
Sure, go ahead, Dr. Hussein, proceed.
Oh, I find this very exciting, so I want to pose it. So Prof, I like your response, thank you very much. Where would unregistered, so I don't know if you are agreeing with me that the current stock of Venezuelans in Trinidad and Tobago is about 50,000. My deduction of 50,000 comes from a UNHCR number I saw earlier in the year, and then I sort of superimposed onto that some of the newspaper clippings on Venezuela immigrants arrive, Venezuelan immigrants arrive, illegal inflows, and then I also included the change in density of number of Venezuelans I am seeing in Gasparilla where I live. So I'm going for simplicity with 50,000. And my question is, if it is, there are about 35,000 unregistered Venezuelans, they cannot, by construct, end up anywhere besides the informal non-tradable sector. And otherwise, they will have to come to some degree above the radar. And the second thing is, You are very correct about the Dutch disease and about the Dutch disease in the context of a factor commodity boom from the energy sector that the non-tradable sector would expand. But I react to that by asking you, so if you have an increase in the number of unregistered factors of production from a labor perspective, which sector out of a non-tradable, non-booming, non-energy export, I'm leaving out the energy sector. So non-energy export, import substituting and non-tradable. Which sector is likely to attract this unregistered component? And that brings me to the third element of the re-registration exercise. I think that it's probably unlikely that this advice will be followed, but I think that we should consider registering all the Venezuelans that are here. So that way, yes, there may be much more than we started off with. Yes, we know that they came here via one form of illegal mode or the other. But at the end of the day, we should register and put a cap with this registration process and thereafter become perhaps a little more tougher in terms of surveillance. But at some point, we don't want the labor to capital ratio to become so imbalanced that it triggers an increase in investment on labor intensive types of activity that compromises capital deepening and compromises learning by doing from additional technology. So the main question though comes back to the Dutch disease, but the Dutch disease sector now, the factor boom is no longer the energy sector. If we are applying the Dutch disease resource boom logic, the resource boom is in labor. So I hope that brings a little more clarity. Maybe I didn't ask it the first time. I hope I asked it a little better this time as to I have already gone past the commodity boom and we are now in a recession because of the commodity market. The booming factor of production now is not the energy sector. It is the unregistered aspect of the immigrant labor. That's what I'm saying. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Dr. Hussain. Dr. Gonzalez, would you like to respond?
Yes, quickly, without monopolizing the discussion. First of all, I think that the informal sector generally follows the formal sector. The informal sector never leads the formal sector. The informal sector derives from the formal sector. So strong activity in the formal sector will tend to make the informal sector expand. In our situation, for instance, the demand for labor is a derived demand. It's derived from the demand for the final product. So where I see expansion taking place is in import substitution in agriculture. For example, you already see it. We have more people are returning to the land, they're planting now, they realize there's a demand for agriculture commodities, which wasn't there before. So that you see a demand there and you see Venezuelans going into agriculture. They're going into, from what UNHCR has indicated, you see them going into agriculture. And I expect that that is going to expand as, things get harder in the country, people have to rely more on producing locally and so forth. So that import substitution sector to expand. I expect also to the tradable sector to expand. Foreign exchange is scarce. You have to earn your foreign exchange now. It's no longer available as it was before. In manufacturing, we see, for instance, the manufacturing sector with plans to double their expansion of output. There are about 80 odd companies that are trying to expand their output. They already say that they have increased substantially their exports. They gave some figures recently which indicate that there's an upward trend in terms of the expansion of export in spite of COVID. So I see expansion coming from there. We are just beginning there, not to mention all the new activities that we need to generate in that particular sector. For instance, we have talked a lot about the Phoenix Park export project. They have talked a lot about the Labre project and so forth, the shipyard. All of these are export-oriented projects. If these projects come on stream, there will again be a demand for labor in the tradable sector. So I do not see, for instance, the informal sector and the non-tradable sector, the informal non-tradable sector as leading leading the growth in the country. I can't see how that would be possible because, as I said before, where is the demand in that particular sector? That is a local demand. There's no foreign demand here. That is local demand. And that is a demand derived from essentially what people earn in the formal sector, which would be the import substitution sector and the export sector. So I think labor would follow where that demand is. Labor is not going to be able to create any kind of sector that drives demand. Labor will have to basically follow where entrepreneurs see a profitability, and those are the sectors where I believe that the profitability would be. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I tend to think, and let me say, I agree with you about the registration process. I agree that everybody here should be registered. I think, and I fully agree with it. I admire the emphasis you put on statistics. I think that is very important. We need to have recorded everybody who's here, so we have good statistical information that we can work with. I think the sooner we do that, the better for all of us. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Gonzalez. Dr. Sawari, would you like to weigh in on the conversation? Dr. Sawari, you're going to have to put your mic on.
Two quick things. One is the suggestion by Dr. Hussein that we register all Venezuelans here. I agree with one proviso, which is that they should be carefully screened for any criminal elements, because I think that is a factor in the illegal immigration. And the second thing that I would say is that we have to find a way of patrolling our borders. And the first thing we have to do is to get the Coast Guard to understand that their place of residence is not the Chaguaramas Peninsula, that they are not meant to be there 7 days a week. Second thing that we need to get them to understand is that they have 12 ships, and if some of them need repair, they should do them repaired. I'm not saying it's all in their control, but they should do that. And secondly, with 12 ships, it seems to me that you have the capacity to patrol the borders. And the third thing on the economic front I want to say is that if we had a sizable Venezuelan population here and we integrated them properly in the economy, and we had the borders properly patrolled with an effective Coast Guard, we could create the conditions, perhaps post Maduro, where that eastern seaboard in Venezuela and the Cedros area in Trinidad and Tobago could be mutually developed to create a kind of commercial capability across the seas that have not yet been envisioned. But the eastern seaboard of Venezuela and Trinidad and Tobago's Cedros coast and Gulf coast, we do have the capacity for building something here that can have not only opportunities for trade and entrepreneurship and investment and development, but could also have international appeal. So we've got to see the imaginative possibilities, but we also have to be very practical about how we manage the current situation as well. And one part of the practicality is to acknowledge that there are 50 or 60,000 Venezuelans here. Screen them properly, decide who are staying here. And I agree, we should put a ceiling on the numbers, and we should patrol the borders, but then the Coast Guards has to stop sleeping in Chaguaramas or whatever they do there. Secondly, the boats have to be on the sea. And thirdly, they must do their job. That is what the Coast Guard is for, to man the coast, to guard the coast.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Tiwari. Just as a segue point, I just want to highlight, and Dr. Tiwari, you alluded to it earlier, in the absence of an implementation plan with tiers or phases of activities that is supported by resources, then a strategy is quite merely a document that takes space up on a shelf. So that in any discussion or strategy or intervention that is being proposed, what is important, of course, is resourcing it, which you've spoken so well to this afternoon. Dr. Hussein, I know you wanted to respond, so please go ahead.
So, for the benefits of the listeners and the audience we have, let me say that this is a golden opportunity to engage, certainly Professor Gonzalez, in terms of this particular topic. He has tremendous experience in the areas of international relations and economic theory. So certainly I am trying to engage him, and the rest of you all should. So Prof, again, I think where we are not necessarily seeing eye to eye is on the nature of the new factor boom. So we are in 2020, and the factor boom, the energy factor boom, to me, came to an end around 2015, the pronounced aspect of it. The tail part of it would still go on because we still produce a significant amount of natural gas in terms of barrel of oil equivalent, but the prices are not there as compared to 2008, nor is the production level. To me, the current factor boom, and the one that we are interested here by way of dialogue, is the 50,000 quote-unquote Venezuelans. And I am saying that the part of the factor boom that troubles me is based on an assumption I'm making, is that 35,000 of the 50,000 that I am, again, all of these are assumptions, I am assuming are unregistered.
Unregistered, undocumented.
Sorry, undocumented. And the way the Rebezinski effect works is that the sectors that are intensive in the use of the undocumented workers will expand. And to me, these sectors, though, again, I am actually collecting some empirical data, but the sectors I see expanding are the bars. So you look around and you see the bars expanding because there is a certain amount of inelasticity with the demand for these commodities, and also because the Venezuelan women later shift in the demand curve. So although you move down the demand curve a little, the shift of the demand curve has become more appealing and lucrative and attractive, has led to an increase in overall in the quantity consumed. That's my assumption. Groceries sell a lot of inelastic goods. So I think the groceries are not really closing, they are expanding, and they are using undocumented workers to facilitate the expansion. And even the retail food outlets, because of Engel's law, remains a certain amount intact. Now, I'm not disputing at all that some of the other non-tradable sectors that you mentioned would have closed. So my perspective is that working through the Rebezinski effect, there is an expansion in a part of the non-tradable sectors that is intensive in the use of undocumented workers. And this expansion requires some degree of capital to facilitate it. And my fear is that some degree of capital to facilitate it will compromise or can compromise either directly the expansion of the import substituting or the non-energy export sector, or indirectly the potential expansion of those two sectors. That's all I'm saying. At the end of the day, I have to have empirical material to substantiate this. All I have right now is casual empiricism. I've collected 200 questionnaires, and perhaps by the time we have the next seminar, I will have some hard data. But that's the theorizing that I want to leave with you and the people on the seminar this evening as to where I think the logic of the problem lies.
Yes, Roger, I understand where you're coming from. You're saying that basically areas which are intense in, let's say, low skill, unskilled labor would want to benefit from the presence of these 50,000 Venezuelans, and capital would follow it, and in order to make that immigration, what you call the immigration surplus, which you mean to make a surplus of profits of capital as a result of that labor. So you're saying that they're going to invest more in bars and restaurants and these things which employ that labor. Now, my concern basically is that I'm not sure the demand is there for that kind of expansion. I'm not sure that that supply could even create a demand, because the way I see things here is that households have to be very careful how they're spending. They have to prioritize their expenditure now. The expenditure basically comes in a situation like this, comes at food and then other essentials, medicines and school books and all of these things. This is what expenditure goes to. It hardly goes, it's not going to go to bars and to restaurants and all of these things. As far as I see, those are things are not where they are the last things in a way you prioritize in terms in this situation. So I'm not so sure that you're going to get the demand you need to really do that kind of expansion. I feel that same labor could also drift into manufacturing and agriculture, and probably even a higher wage if those sectors expand much more quickly. There is a growing demand for agricultural stuff. Agricultural prices are going to go up, food prices are going to go up, so therefore it will be attractive for people to go into agriculture. Similarly, in the export sector, I expect that there will be an expansion of output there, a greater demand for labor, and the wages there might probably be, if not comparable, even probably higher than what you would find in that informal sector. So the difference between us is largely a question of where the demand is going to go. And I tend to suspect that the demand, unless the government drives that by huge deficits and spending a lot of money and that inflates things and so forth, which I don't see happening, the demand is not there for that kind of activity. So I think that's the difference between us. We're going to have to establish it on an empirical basis and look and see basically, the Rybensky effect is basically more labor coming in, lowers the price of labor, and it attracts more capital, largely on the assumption of no change in demand. Rybensky effects assume that demand more or less remains the same, so that makes the capital go towards exporting. But if demand significantly changes, I think you don't get that same effect. But as we say, we'll have to monitor this and see how it goes and try to see really if that is taking place or not. But as I say, I don't see how that informal sector could expand significantly to upset the non-energy sector and the import substitution sector. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez, Dr. Sawari, and Dr. Hussain. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I will take this opportunity to invite each of our panelists in the following order: Dr. Sawari, Dr. Gonzalez, and Dr. Hussain to offer a few closing comments, and just to let you know that this is going to be the first conversation in several conversations to come on the topic. As you can tell, it is timely, it is relevant, it is real, it is brilliant, it is Trinidad and Tobago in 2021. So Dr. Sawari, please offer your closing comments.
Yes, I will be very brief. We were never prepared for this migration from Venezuela, although we should have been, because the signs were very clear from the Chavez days and ultimately the succession by Maduro, that instability in Venezuela and economic deteriorating economic conditions would have triggered massive migration. And Trinidad and Tobago did nothing really to prepare. The migrants came and we were unprepared. We are lucky that we had social organizations in Trinidad and Tobago that played a role. We are also fortunate that we had a resident Venezuelan community here that played a role. People who have been living here for some years. And we are we are lucky that certain institutions that exist here on the basis of humanitarian concern also became involved. But the one positive decision that we took was to legalize many of the migrants who were here. And that has brought some stability to some part of the community. But I believe that is the minimum that we can do. That is only the beginning of the process. The second part of the process must be to regularize everybody who are here after the screening is done, and to take a more to take a stronger role in terms of protection of the borders. And for that, the Coast Guard has to be awakened from their beauty sleep, and the government has to have a serious policy for the borders. The thing is that we have a challenge here now with this immigration, but we have multiple economic and financial challenges as well. And I think the two are related. I don't think we can have a successful immigrant absorption, integration, and deployment strategy unless we have a successful monetary and economic policy that are aligned and determines priorities. And one of those priorities must be to structure away from energy, to do the best we can in the current circumstances in energy between now and 2023, when things hopefully may get better. But until then, we cannot just twiddle our thumbs. So we've got to address the energy sector problems with solutions. And we've got to shift focus away from energy into other areas. We can develop the manufacturing for export, develop the services for export, but we also have to have new investments. And those areas have to be in tune with the movement away, the movement of the world away from fossil fuel and into areas that have to do with climate change responsiveness, sustainable development, green industries, basically renewable energy and renewable industries, etc. And I feel that if we took those very, very strategic but necessary decisions, and we coupled that with our use of the ocean, first of all, border patrol in the ocean, and then secondly, the use of the ocean as a resource of various kinds, from fishing to tourism sports, and the use of the ocean as an attractor for building a tourism industry together with the sustainable side. And we planned for that in a systematic way over 2 or 3 years. I believe with a, properly managed, efficiently executed, well implemented, and also taking into account that you cannot do things without the recognition of meritorious capacity and talented people. If we did that well, I think we could harness the new resources that have been brought here through the immigration process. Basically put our people, our own people, back to work and have a pretty buoyant economy as we begin to thrive outside of the energy sector, even as we make gains in the energy sector over the next few years. So I don't think that the immigration problem, the Venezuelan challenge, can be isolated from the other economic and financial strategies that we need to use, because the success of the immigration integration strategies, the integration of the Venezuelans and their effective deployment and the harnessing of their talent and their energies and their resources and the leveraging of their presence here to do things with their home territory and with Latin America. I think those things depend on what we do in terms of financial strategy and economic strategy and the kind of fiscal space that we make. So I don't want to divorce the immigration problem, the Venezuelan immigration issue, from the need for a sustained and sustainable financial and economic strategy for the country, because they are interdependent. And I would close with that thought.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sawari. Dr. Gonzalez?
Yes. Well, I started by looking at the likelihood of more Venezuelans coming up this side. And I pointed out where that I do not expect that the flow out of Venezuela would be accelerated to the same degree as it has done in the last 3 years. We had about 1.4 million coming since 2017, but I suggested that because of certain factors, the question of borders being sealed now and regular routes being closed, the fact that governments are a lot more conscious of how to deal with the problem. Yeah, and you also had what you may call the external factor, which is that an American government, a new American government with a possibly new approach to Venezuela. And that to some extent I expect would decelerate the flow. But yet still you would have a fair amount, that's I pointed out, between 600,000 to 900,000 moving. If that is the case, we would expect an additional probably 10, 15,000 in Trinidad. As I pointed out, the UNHCR talked about 6,000 that they expect additional in for 2021. I think, and they largely talk in terms of the registered people, but if you go to the undocumented people, you'll find that that figure would certainly go up, probably 10,000, 12,000 or something like that. So as I agree with Roger, to some extent, we may be looking at about 50,000, 55,000 here. And the question is, how do we go about absorbing additional amounts? So even those who are here, there are lots of here who do not have jobs. I think the survey I saw for 2019, it pointed to about 35% that do not have jobs in this country. And then you have a substantial amount that do not have access to healthcare, do not have access to education, and a number of social services, right? Which they need to have access to. The good thing is about, which to some extent I was pleased to read, was that about 95, even 98% of the Venezuelans who are here, they have basic access to electricity and a home, so that they're not on the streets sleeping, and that they're in a home renting to some extent, or people put them up and so forth. So that is a positive side. They may not have 24-hour access to water and so forth, but at least this is the situation in the country generally, which we all face. So the problem, as I see it, is really, and someone raised the question about the social costs. What is the cost of providing these services at a time when government cannot afford it? We're in a difficult situation fiscally, as a result of the decline of the energy sector. How do we tackle this problem of these 50,000 Venezuelans. I believe to some extent that we can manage. We would have to some extent to rely on further assistance from outside. I believe that the UNHCR has requested something like about 14 or 15, or probably more. I can't remember the exact figure, but somewhere in the vicinity of about 15 million US to deal with the Venezuelan presence here. That is to provide some of the basic services that they need that I'm referring to. So you need some additional help, and I believe that that assistance may be forthcoming with a new approach to Venezuela that may come from the Western powers, Europe and the United States, Canada, and so forth, that may want to probably put some more money in terms of helping you to integrate the Venezuelans. We still have, in spite of our difficulties, we still have a fair amount of resources in terms of spreading education and health and so forth. And we could probably stretch things a bit to absorb a few more. But we have to be careful as we go forward here, because we know how easy it is to deprive your own nationals of these services. So the point basically I want to make is that the situation is difficult, but it is not insurmountable. With some foreign aid, I believe we could manage it and finish 2021 on a relatively stable note. So I will end on that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gonzalez. Dr. Hussain, please feel free to offer your closing comments, and you can unmute your mic accordingly.
Thank you very much. All I would say is that this conversation and seminar makes it even clearer the importance of collecting statistics on these migrants. And it has to be both the registered, the previously documented, and then those that came after, so we could have an idea of who are these people on our shores that are here. Our borders are closed, so they are here probably for a little while. We would have an idea, we would be able to track them, we would know various things about them. And so we would then be able, as technocrats, to model and to map the stock of migrant skills and their capacities onto the various growth trajectories we want for different sectors of the Trinidad and Tobago economy, to bring us closer to a win-win solution rather than boom, 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 perhaps type of planning. So that's what I will stop with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hussain. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your time this evening. I would like to encourage each of you to stay safe, keep alert as regards the COVID protocols, and do look out via email, via WhatsApp for our conversations on this very important topic facing Trinidad and Tobago. Do have a pleasant evening and take care.
Okay, good night. Night to all, yes. Okay.